Thank you very much for inviting me to this occasion. My goodness, everybody looks so serious. The meeting seemed to be so official. I'm a bit trembling. But really, I am delighted. As mentioned, I have been member of International House for many years. My good friend, Setsuko Thurlow, invited me to join. And I have considered this place as my home in Tokyo. Thank you, staff members, for your gracious courtesy. Thank you. Tonight, I'm going to share my life as a victim of Hiroshima and later as an activist of nuclear weapons. I have 50 minutes or so. I plan to spend the first 15 minutes or so to talk about me as a teenager growing up in Hiroshima and that fateful day and aftermath a little bit, and the following 15 minutes to talk about my life in Canada and the United States. And the remainder of time we'll discuss about recent developments in nuclear disarmament field, and including the huge stories of United Nations adoption of the prohibition treatment and treaty of the nuclear weapon, and also including the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize. As a survivor, I have spent most of my adult life as a disarmament educator and advocate, as well as my chosen profession of social work. And I try to make my personal testimony as much as I could, because often the discussion of nuclear weapons tend to be so abstract and vague and technical and scientific. But I feel very strongly the people should be in the center and at the front of the nuclear weapon debate. Well, when I talk about Hiroshima, I usually talk about my little nephew, 4-year-old nephew, who became so badly burned, and he just ended to be a chunk of flesh, as I remember, the blackened and swollen. And that little boy kept begging for water in a faint voice, water and water. Because this image became the symbol to me in my mind of all the innocent children of the world who are faced with catastrophic danger of nuclear explosion at any moment. So his memory, his image have become the driving force for me to keep on pushing to work for the total nuclear disarmament. I was 13 years old, grade 8 student, mobilized by the Army to act as a decoding assistant. Can you imagine? 13-year-old girl dealing with the top secrets of the nation? That's what we did. So from my school, 315 girls perished in that. And I lost my own very close relatives, uncles and aunts and cousins, sister and sister-in-law and nephew. 9 of them suddenly disappeared from my life. Well, I am here in front of you tonight because I was not in the center part of the city, but I was at the Army headquarters. But most of the girls from my schools were taken to the center part of the city, where all the grade 7 and grade 8 students from all the high schools of the city of Hiroshima were brought in together to do some clearing job. After the old buildings were built, the city wanted to widen the road and be prepared for the anticipated fire bombing. But most of them were simply vaporized, carbonized. And that number includes my own sister-in-law, who was directing the students. Well, my sister and her 4-year-old child I just spoken about were going to the medical clinic. They were on the bridge, and both of them ended up being a chunk of melted flesh. The cremation took place on the mountain. The soldiers came, they dug up the hole, threw the bodies into the hole, poured the gasoline through the lighted match, and with a bamboo pole, they kept turning the bodies by saying, well, brain is not quite burned yet. Stomach needs to be burned some more, or cooked some more, something like that. Very coarse language. A 13-year-old girl just stood there and just watched the whole thing without any emotional reaction. And the memory of this troubled me for many years, because I did remember clearly that I didn't even have a drop of tears as I watched my own sister and her child being burned. What kind of human being am I? I couldn't even shed tears. I couldn't even feel sad. Until I went to university, started learning something about psychology and how human being behaves in the ultimate condition and so on. Started reading Dr. Lifton's book and his experiment and so on. And I learned about the fact that in the ultimate condition such as that, we experience the cessation of emotional responses. Just stop feeling. Cognitively, we function, but emotionally, we stop feeling. And that theory helped me. I stopped blaming myself. I wasn't exactly inhuman. And I gradually found many of my friends and others who had the similar experiences. Dr. Lifton called this psychic numbing or psychic closing off. I don't agree with that psychiatrist, all the theories, but this one I do. And I told him personally how much I appreciated this theory. Now, radiation worked on people in many different ways, mysteriously and in a random fashion. Some people were killed instantly. Some lived for a week, a month, years. And some, you know the story of Sadako. I think she was affected 10 years later when she was age 12. We were very happy that my uncle and his wife were intact and they were okay. They didn't have any external injuries or burns or anything. But those people started showing purple spots all over the body about a week or 10 days later. And they started having symptoms like, anyway, my parents went and looked after them until their death. My mother said their butts, their intestines seemed to be rotten and coming out as a liquid. And that's how they died. So in those days, when we had the purple spots anywhere, that was a sure sign of death. So the first thing we did in the morning before we got dressed was to check every part of the body to make sure we live another day. So thus, my beloved city of Hiroshima suddenly became desolation, heaps of ashes and rubble, skeleton and blackened corpses. And it was indeed an indiscriminate, massive massacre of non-combatants. Majority of residents of the city were non-combatant, civilians, children, elderly, women, and so on. By the end of 1945, 140,000 people perished in Hiroshima alone. And by today, about 260,000 people have died as an effect of the radiation. Because it's not, the death didn't stop on that day, but for all 73 years, death has been continuing. I really hate to talk about the numbers because to me, reducing those precious lives into numbers is a trivialization of their dignity. It troubles me. Each person had a name, and each person was loved by someone. In the aftermath, survivors endured physical devastation of near starvation, homelessness, lack of medical care, spreading of social discrimination because they saw us survivors as a dangerous, contaminating factor. And they suffered from no service from the government. For the first 12 years, the government did nothing to help the suffering people. Some surviving officials of the city tried to find some food and clothing, but national government did nothing. And not only that, that was an unprecedented social and political chaotic time because of the surrender of Japan in the war and collapse of military system and arrival of the occupation forces. It was a very difficult time. General MacArthur arrived, and he said, I came to Japan with two goals. One is to demilitarize Japan, and one is to democratize Japan. We welcome that. And he did some good things, such as reform of labor system, financial system, giving better life for women, women's participation in politics, and some very good things. But as far as dealing with the issues of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think he did something contrary. I will give you just a few examples. They established an agency called ABCC, Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, one in Hiroshima, one in Nagasaki. And we rejoiced. Finally, we get some medication, some medical treatment, and some doctors welcomed because they thought they could get some information, because they didn't know how to deal with this new type of medical problem. When somebody had the fever, they thought that was scarlet fever, that level. But we soon found out ABCC was not to offer treatment or medication or anything, but simply to do the medical research. And you can imagine how the survivors felt about that. Not only once as a target of the atomic bombing, but for the second time as a research material. We were used as guinea pig. Another example is the censorship of the information. I think some newspaper companies, I think one of them was Asahi, if somebody's here, papers were not allowed to write anything which is not advantageous to American occupation forces, I can understand. So if you write anything to do with human suffering caused by the atomic bombing, that was considered to be against their interest. Therefore, it was perfectly all right to write about triumphant scientific, technological advancement that the United States showed by producing those bombs. That was okay. The world can learn about that. But to learn about human suffering caused by those bombs was not to be learned by the world. This is why censorship took place. But worse than censorship was a confiscation of things from survivors' lives, like diaries. Some people kept diaries. Somebody wrote letters to the loved ones. Somebody wrote haiku and tankas. They had so much pain in their heart, they had to express that in the literary form. Or photographs, films, even medical charts. All those things were confiscated and they were shipped back to the United States. 23,000 items in all. Following this massive trauma, survivors had to repress their pain in silence and in isolation, because it was very clear that occupation forces did not wish us to express our thoughts and feelings and the pains and agony. So people naturally kept their mouths shut. With the return of the sovereignty in 1952, a flood of information became available about the bombing. And this enabled the scholars and researchers and journalists to try to see the meaning of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the historical perspective in the global context. And we learned that the main motive of the bombing was not really military, but political. And the survivors rejected the American myth that the use of the bomb was necessary in order to end the war quickly. Now, it'll be a fascinating study and discussion, but the historical background of this period I would not discuss here tonight because that will take all night and that won't leave me the time to discuss other things. But historical background, which involved emperor's future status and planned invasion of Japan and the planned Soviet Union's joining Allied forces to finish Japan together, and Soviet Union's finally keeping the promise, and they started attacking Japanese army in Manchuria, and so forth and so forth. This is a fascinating part of history. I hope you would find a good book and inform yourself about that. Well, with the researchers and scholars' research, we began to see the meaning of the Hiroshima-Nagasaki experience, the meaning of our survival. And after much struggle, survivors came to become convinced our moral imperative, that is, to keep speaking to the world about our experience and to make sure nobody else will repeat our experience. It was a sense of mission for us to warn the world about the danger of nuclear weapons and to undertake the struggle to help rid of the world of the scourge of nuclear weapons. So with this conviction, survivors has been speaking out around the world for the past several decades because we felt it was moral imperative. I have used that word already, but to make sure the world will be safe, clean, and just for all human beings, for the future generations to enjoy. Well, 1954, I graduated from university in Hiroshima. And I had the opportunity to receive scholarship to go to the United States to study social work, by the way, because, in that city, thousands of orphans were running wild with the petty crimes and pickpockets and so on. That was the only way they could survive because they were, during the war, they were taken out of the city to protect them in the mountains and hills. When the war ended, they were brought back to the city, but the city wasn't there. Their parents weren't there. Their homes weren't there. So about 5,000 children started running wild and no help. So some selfless adults, like my own church minister, and other citizens started offering orphanages and so on. I grew up watching adults, how they dealt with the crisis of their lives. They don't have to teach us. The children watch adults, how they behave in a situation like that. And I felt, I want to be like them. I want to be a helping person. And that led me to choose the profession of social work. I wanted to study it, but at that time, Japan did not offer social work training at the higher level. So I was advised to go to North America to get that training. Anyway, that was in 1954. And if you recall, something special happened that spring. At the Bikini Atoll, United States tested the biggest hydrogen bomb and causing the catastrophe like we in Hiroshima and Nagasaki suffered. Well, I arrived in the States in August, and as soon as they found me and they wanted to hear my opinion about what was happening in Marshall Islands. So I was very naive, fresh out of college, and I said, well, the people seem to be suffering the same way as we did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and contaminating the environment and so forth. This has to stop right away. That appeared in the paper the following day. And that was the beginning of my receiving hate letters at the university in the States. How dare you? Who is giving the scholarship? Go home, go back to Japan. I just arrived a few days earlier. And remember Pearl Harbor. Well, I guess I was so naive, I was not prepared for this. I couldn't go to the classes. I stayed in the professor's home alone, and I had the time of soul searching. What am I going to do? I just arrived, I can't go back. Shall I pretend by putting the zipper over my mouth that I don't know anything about the atomic bomb? It was a temptation for me to stop talking about it. But I'm grateful that I was able to come out of that trauma with a stronger conviction. It was my moral responsibility to keep speaking out against that. Actually, I was very disturbed by the very uncritical and blunt, uncritical and attitude of American people. And they were following the government's line, American myth, and justifying what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was a chilling reminder for me of the wartime behavior of Japanese in swallowing government propaganda and brainwashing. Then, after a year at that university in the States, I arrived University of Toronto in Toronto, Canada. I met a Canadian teacher. I married. And I found Toronto I found the people of Toronto complacent, indifferent, and rather uninformed. And they were acting as though this issue of atomic bombing was a problem of Japan and the United States, not their problem as Canadians. Without realizing that Canada was a part of the Manhattan Project. And one Canadian scientist was killed in the accident of the Manhattan Project. And the uranium used for Hiroshima bombs came from Great Bear Lake in northwestern territory. It was shipped to Ontario, near Toronto, near Port Hope. It was processed there, and then it was again shipped to United States. And some came from Belgian Congo, I think. So Canada was very much involved. But most Canadians didn't know about this fact. And also, I learned that Canadian Prime Minister wrote in his diary, he was pleased those bombs were used on Japanese, not on white races of Europe. Well, I found in those days, in 50s, 60s, 70s, no media was doing their job. They were not informing the people, and the schools were not informing. Between 1970 to 90s, for 20 years, I was able to work with the Toronto Board of Education as a social worker. And that gave me the opportunity to start talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The teachers soon found out what experience I had, so the teachers asked me to come to their classrooms and speak about my personal experiences and so forth. I was grateful that some people were interested in informing younger generation about that. But soon I realized it was good, but not really good enough. This kind of education should not be left to individual teachers as their responsibility. The system as a whole have to take responsibility. That means reviewing the curriculum if it's updated or not, and retraining the teachers so they would know how to handle these new issues. So what I did do was that to locate some progressive-minded trustees. The trustees are elected, not like in Japan. Here, they were appointed, I understand. But I was successful in finding out some progressive type of trustees. And we felt that in order to change the whole system, we have to work at the top. The decision makers have to be convinced this change was necessary. We couldn't start it at the bottom. Teachers were without support. They were taking their own risks. So we invited the scientists from university to come to the board meeting, and we asked the moderator of the United Church of Canada to come, and the scientists would give the scientific aspect of nuclear weapon, and the moderator would discuss historical or social and the moral issues of the bombs. This was the beginning of our attempt to educate the trustees. And that was the beginning of establishing the special committee, which started reviewing the curriculum. I think at that time, Boston Board of Education was doing a fabulous job. So we worked with Boston people. And so it was a success story. We began to change the system little bit at a time. And but unfortunately, every so many years we have the election. Sometime later, the more conservative trustees were chosen. That meant what we started was destroyed completely. So that's the weakness of that system. But let me tell you some of the successful things. I was delighted after this change in the system. I suggested that all the high school students would be challenged with the project. And they write essays, or they produce the music, they do make the artwork of any kind on the title of the meaning of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was a huge success. The students wrote wonderful essays and artwork and so forth. And we asked the Canada's ambassador of disarmament to the UN, and also Margaret Lawrence, if Canadian embassy people are here, Margaret Lawrence, top-notch writer of Canada, to be the final judge of selecting the two winners. And those two lucky winners were able to be invited to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You see, Toronto, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki Boards of Education, they all worked together, and the YMCA joined together. And I was able to bring those students. And CBC produced the wonderful film, and when they arrived in Japan, NHK followed them around. So at both ends, their work was advertised. And after the project, upon their return to Canada, they were able to go to Ottawa to be met by the Prime Minister, and they were able to give the gift of the folded paper crane from Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But anyway, among the high school students, we made the issue visible. Yeah, to break the silence among the Canadians, especially for the 70th anniversary of Hiroshima, Nagasaki. We introduced a number of activities, like starting the commemorative events at the City Hall, organizing Ban the Bomb March, and a public forum at the university, exhibition of photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and so forth. One symbolic event was that in order to celebrate the sesquicentennial event of Toronto, the mayor found about $500,000, and the citizen wanted to use that money to build the Peace Garden at the City Hall Square. And the mayor asked me to act as a go-between. I was able to negotiate with the cities. So we got the flame of peace from the Peace Garden and the water from the rivers of Nagasaki. We brought them back to Toronto. And the Pope came from Vatican, and the Queen came from London. And it turned out to be a huge event. And that was another event which made the issue visible. But perhaps most successful program was that in 1974, when Canadian government decided to sell CANDU reactor to India, we were upset because we were fearful they might abuse this so-called gift. It was supposed to have been sold, but we knew the taxpayers' money was used as subsidy. So anyway, we wanted to do something to express our disapproval. We wrote letter to all the professors from coast to coast, asked them to donate $25 so their name can be written on the full-page ads. And we got enough money to put 3 full-page ads in Toronto Star. And so we had about 300 names of professors from coast to coast. They were concerned. After all, they are knowledgeable people. They knew what was going on, but they were not strong enough to take initiative and take action. But when somebody else started the action, they came to join. And those people started groups in their cities. And I think it was significant. And thank goodness we do have very active peace groups. I think we did a lot, and I think Canadian people became very aware of the problem, and well, we do have wonderful collectives, the hardworking, well-informed leaders who are working from coast to coast. And in America too, I take my hats off to American colleagues. I think it must be almost impossible state where the military and industrial complex is controlling the society. I sometimes feel very empathetic to them, but they are working hard even in the situation when situation seem hopeless. So both in Canada and the United States, there are a lot of hard-working, committed people who are determined to work with us, survivors and citizens of Japan, to get rid of the greatest evil, which is nuclear weapon. You know, I haven't even started talking about some great thing which has happened. I'll just simply make an announcement. After 7 decades of hard work, last July 7th, United Nations, at the United Nations in New York, 122 nations voted in favor of creating a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. Can you imagine how I felt? My goodness, I was speechless at that moment. Something I wished to, but I never expected that I would see that moment, and I did. I was speechless, but my thoughts were with 100,000 of people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki who were victimized, and it was their hope and dream that day came. And that day finally came, and we have a big job to do, and I'm sorry, that's the part I wanted to discuss. I think I dwelt in the first part of the talk too much, but maybe during the discussion we can talk about it. Something great happened last July 7th. Now we have the United Nations adopted treaty to prohibit nuclear weapon. All we have to do is to make sure that this be enforced with 50 nations ratifying it. And that's a big job, but we have to. After all, we spent over 70 years to reach that point. And this is the very point I came to Japan to talk to people too. We have to pressure the government, Abe government, which is rejecting our idea. So I am asking you to study the issue closely, and please, each one of you, do your best to pressure the government. This must happen. This treaty must come into force. So this is just the beginning. Prohibition is only the beginning. We have to work many months, many years yet until we reach the point where total elimination of nuclear weapon. But first we have to complete this process. This very first step of the process. And this is where you have the power to use. You have a vote. You have your MP to work with. And you can move Mr. Abe. Well, I am sorry I was not able to elaborate the last part of my talk, but forgive me. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.